Manchester has long been a city defined by its headlines, tales of the hacienda, the music scene, and the infamous street wars involving the Cheetham Hill and Gooch gangs. But the story we are covering today, the Gooch gang gangster who executed his family, reveals a darkness that operates far away from the street corners. It is a story not of gangland territory, but of domestic devastation. And it begins not with a gunshot, but with silence. The first thing neighbours remembered was how quiet the house became in the summer of 2007. Not the type of quiet that comes when a family leaves for holiday or when school exam season keeps teenagers indoors. This was the other kind, the type that makes you notice the absence of sound. No slammed doors from a 13-year-old late for school. No music leaking through bedroom windows from a teenage girl rehearsing for a talent appearance she hoped would take her to university. No tired mother dragging shopping bags in from the car. Just stillness, sitting over the modest semi-detached home on Thelwell Avenue in the Manchester district of Fallowfield. Before the silence, there had been a family. Their names were Beverley Samuels, 36, Kesha Wizzart, 18, and Fred Wizzart, 13. Beverley was a nurse, often working shifts at Manchester Royal Infirmary. Kesha was bright, ambitious, and known to many across the city for her appearance on the ITV talent show Stars in Their Eyes Kids. Fred was lanky, funny, often seen with headphones slung around his neck. Manchester is a city that carries its tragedies openly, but for that brief summer, this family seemed like any other, trying to move forward after a breakup, revision season, and the pressures that come with raising teenagers alone. To understand how the quiet came, you have to start before the house on Thelwell Avenue. You have to start with a man named Pierre Williams. Williams was born in Birmingham in 1974. His early years appear unremarkable from a distance: education, sport, part-time jobs, social circles. But those who later encountered him noted an intensity beneath the surface, a need for control wrapped in charisma. He became a qualified fitness instructor. He could talk about nutrition, training, and health in a way that made people trust him. He had girlfriends, friends, nighttime companions, and acquaintances who crossed paths with him in Birmingham's nightlife and gym circuits. What almost no one realized until later is that Williams carried a different pattern: jealousy, sexual coercion, entitlement, and sudden violence. By the early 2000s, he moved north and found work in Manchester. He blended into the city easily. Manchester has always welcomed people seeking new beginnings: Irish bricklayers in the post-war years, Caribbean workers during the Windrush era, Pakistani and Bangladeshi families through the 60s and 70s. Williams arrived without much noise and began a new life among new faces. Somewhere among those new faces was Beverley Samuels. They met after Beverley's relationship with her children's father ended. At first, the relationship between Beverley and Williams looked like the usual second attempt at companionship. Messages exchanged after shifts, evenings out, sometimes awkward scheduling around childcare. Friends later described it as intermittent, with long pauses and emotional distance. Williams drifted in and out, never fully settling into the family, always returning with an air of possession. What Beverley didn't know, what few did, was that Williams already had a documented history of violence against women. Police files existed, buried in the archives of another city, detailing strangulation and sexual coercion. But like many cases involving male sexual violence, convictions didn't arrive in time to protect the next victim. Williams learned from each encounter how to isolate, how to intimidate, how to push boundaries without leaving visible marks until he wanted to, and how to talk his way out when confronted. By 2006, Beverley began to detach from Williams. She focused on the children: Kesha with her A-levels and ambitions to study law, Fred with school and adolescence and the household finances that come with single motherhood. She blocked Williams' advances, limited his access, and tried to build a future that didn't include him. To Williams, that was the beginning of an insult he wasn't prepared to absorb. The early parts of 2007 showed the first signs that something had shifted. Williams turned up unannounced. He made sexual advances that were rejected. He sought control over a home that no longer belonged to him. Kesha, nearly an adult, was unimpressed by him. Fred didn't see him as any type of father figure. Beverley wanted him gone. The last confirmed sighting of the family alive was Wednesday, 11 July 2007. During ordinary routines, Kesha picking up results information for school, Beverley checking her shift schedule, Fred preparing for football. Nothing suggested a catastrophic intersection between the three. What police later reconstructed was that on the night of 12 July 2007, Williams returned to the house with a hammer. The exact sequence inside the home is known only through forensic reconstruction, but it was methodical and sustained. He sexually assaulted Beverley and Kesha. He attacked them with a blunt object, later identified as a 2-pound engineer's hammer, and struck them multiple times. At some point, Fred was dragged from his bed and killed. The injuries were catastrophic: cranial fractures, blunt force trauma, defensive wounds that showed they tried to fight back. Williams left the bodies in the home and walked out into the night. When police eventually entered the scene days later, the temperature inside the house had risen. Drawers were open, items displaced, blood patterns traced the roots of struggle. A Bible was found with highlighted passages and references to special oil. Cocoa butter was found mixed with blood used during the assaults. It was a mix of forensic precision and ritualistic behavior that left officers disturbed long after the case closed. While pathology teams began work inside Thelwall Avenue, detectives turned outward to phone records, movement trails, witness sightings, and past relationships. Williams was identified as the last known adult male to have access to the home. He became a suspect almost immediately. When they located him, Williams was calm. He denied involvement. He spoke as if the deaths were part of someone else's life, someone else's tragedy. Yet the evidence began stacking against him. By the time the public learned what had happened, the silence on Thelwall Avenue had already transformed into something else. Grief, media crowds, flowers on walls, and the type of mourning that stays with a city. That was only the beginning. Because as detectives built their case, they discovered that Williams' past didn't simply contain bad relationships or jealousy. It contained a pattern, stretching back years, crossing cities, crossing partners, and linking Birmingham to Manchester in a chain of violence that had gone largely unpunished. The trial had not even begun. And yet, it was already clear the murders of Beverley, Kesha, and Fred were the endpoint of something that started long before Manchester. It started with Pierre Williams. When detectives from Greater Manchester Police began reconstructing the final hours of Beverley Samuels and her children, they worked backwards from the physical world: blood patterns, fracture lines, disrupted furniture, and the cold logic of forensic pathology. Inside the house, each room behaved like a witness. Blood cast-off patterns on the staircase suggested someone had been struck while moving a smashed door. Frame indicated forced entry into one of the bedrooms. The angle of impact on the skull fractures told a story of sustained overhead blows, consistent with a hammer swung by someone standing over a victim already on the ground. The coroner's team noted bruising on Beverley and Kesha consistent with sexual assault and restraint, while Fred's injuries pointed to sudden, overwhelming force. It would take weeks to map every fragment, but the early message was clear. This was not a sudden argument. It was an execution inside a home. Williams, during his police interviews, denied everything. He called himself a bystander in the life of a family he claimed to care about. He said he had not been in the house on the night in question, that someone else must have entered, that the crime was inexplicable. But the silence of Thelwall Avenue had already yielded evidence. Detectives began the slow process of cataloguing the microscopic debris Williams had left behind, confident that the science would speak louder than his denials. Once the forensic net began tightening around him, detectives turned to the second thread, his history. Williams' police file did not look like a man caught in a one-off loss of control. It looked like escalation. Detectives uncovered a series of reports from West Midlands Police, entries that were anonymous, bureaucratic and numerical, but which told a horrifying story. There were reports from 1996 and 1998. Women had come forward with stories of binding, drugging and strangulation. In 2004, a woman in Manchester had reported choking and threats. None of these cases reached open court. They stalled due to lack of evidence or victim withdrawal, statistically mirroring thousands of cases where trauma eclipses the will to testify. When the Manchester murders hit the headlines, officers in Birmingham recognized the name instantly. One senior officer, who later spoke off record, described it as a man we lost track of just when we needed oversight most. This history provided the psychological motive. Forensic psychologists drafted profiles based on crime scene behavior. They noted the mixture of sexual violence and blunt force trauma, the use of personal care products during assault, and the presence of a Bible with specific passages marked in pen. This suggested ritualistic behavior, not in the religious sense, but in the controlled, repetitive sense seen in violent offenders who construct meaning systems around domination. One marked verse referenced special oil used to anoint Aaron's clothes. Investigators did not conclude that Williams held specific religious delusions, rather that he sought symbolic reinforcement for acts rooted in power and sexual entitlement. Meanwhile, outside the clinical rooms of pathology and profiling, Manchester began absorbing the news. The city is no stranger to violence. It has lived through gang wars in Homicide, football, hooliganism, sectarian disputes, and civilian bombings. But violence against children inside their own home triggered a different kind of public grief. It broke the psychological boundary between the dangers outside and the safety expected inside. In August 2007, floral tributes filled the pavement outside Thelwall Avenue. Teachers from Kesha's school arrived in tears. Football teammates of Fred stood together without speaking, unsure what grief looks like at 13. Beverley's colleagues from Manchester Royal Infirmary placed her nursing badge inside a plastic sleeve, taped to the wall so the rain would not destroy it. While the public mourned, the Manchester Major Incident Team built its prosecution file. Williams had been arrested within days of the discovery of the bodies. Media coverage described him as a gym instructor, a former partner, and later a cold-blooded killer. The last phrase did not come from a tabloid headline. It came from Detective Sergeant Ian Foster, the senior investigator, who told reporters that Williams fit the psychological frame of a predator with a pattern of sexual violence. With the DNA results finalised, mobile data mapped, and Birmingham complaints cross-referenced, the Crown Prosecution Service authorised charges: 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of rape. Williams entered a plea of not guilty. His defence strategy, outlined in early legal conferences, was simple. Question the timeline, suggest another assailant, contest forensic contamination, and remind the jury that past allegations were not convictions. The prosecution strategy was different. They would build a story of pattern, opportunity, and control. They would demonstrate that Williams was not merely present in the lives of Beverley and her children, but that he manipulated access, monitored routines, and struck when rejection closed the door on him for the last time. By late winter of 2008, the trial date was set at Manchester Crown Court, Crown Square. 3 families prepared for the ordeal. Reporters sharpened pencils, and detectives, after 7 months of work, began handing their case to the courts. Before the first witness took the stand, one quiet admission moved through the prosecution team and the senior officers who had worked the case. The murders of Beverley, Kesha, and Fred were preventable if an earlier pattern had been recognized, if earlier victims had been believed, if allegations had led to convictions. The tragedy of Thelwall Avenue did not begin in that house. It ended there. On a cold Monday morning in March 2008, the heavy wooden doors of Manchester Crown Court opened to an audience already familiar with the headlines. Detectives who had spent months cataloguing evidence now stepped aside. Solicitors and barristers took their places. Court clerks whispered names, dates, charges. Families of the victims sat quietly in the public gallery, separated from Williams only by the geometry of the courtroom and the rituals of English criminal justice. Williams entered the dock wearing plain clothes. He kept his posture still, eyes forward, expression unreadable. He pleaded not guilty to all counts: 3 murders, 2 rapes, and ancillary offences related to the sexual violence committed before the killings. The prosecution opened with a simple narrative thread. Williams entered the home, sexually assaulted 2 victims, and murdered 3. The Crown did not embellish, dramatise, or theorise motive. The lead prosecutor understood the gravity did not need decoration. He told the jury that forensic evidence would reconstruct the timeline down to minute and metre. He told them they would hear from pathologists, digital data analysts, sexual assault examiners, and neighbours who noticed small things that only became significant later. The first phase focused on scene and science. A forensic pathologist took the stand to describe the order in which injuries likely occurred. She explained the cranial fractures on Beverley and Kesha, multiple impact sites consistent with a hammer swung from above. She described defensive wounds on hands and arms, indicating attempts to shield the head. When she turned to Fred, her voice slowed. There were no defensive wounds. He was likely asleep when Williams entered his room. He was struck with enough force to kill him almost instantly. The jury listened without interruption. Some wrote notes, some wiped their eyes. Next came the forensic scientist, who processed DNA. She presented results from sexual assault kits taken from Beverley and Kesha. DNA samples matched Williams to a statistical certainty. There was no biological evidence of any unknown male. This was the point at which Williams' defense barrister stood to cross-examine. He asked whether contamination was possible. He asked whether multiple transfer events could produce misleading profiles. He asked whether secondary transfer could place Williams' DNA without him committing assault. The scientist held firm. The measurements did not indicate trace incidental contact. They indicated direct sexual contact. The prosecution let the numbers sit in the air before calling the next witness. Digital analysts followed. They traced Williams' phone through cell mask data. Between 10:58 p.m. and 12:24 a.m. on the night of the murders, Williams' mobile connected repeatedly to a mast near Thelwall Avenue. The prosecution mapped the pings against time, generating a timeline that placed Williams near the house during the window of death. The defense countered that a phone does not prove a person's intentions, nor does it prove entry into a house. He suggested that someone else could have committed the crime. He said the prosecution had not proven exclusivity of presence. That was when the prosecution shifted to the second pillar: history and behaviour. This was the moment the jury finally heard the details that had been buried in the Birmingham police files. One of Williams' former partners took the stand behind a privacy screen. She described strangulation during sex. She described waking up after being drugged. She described an incident where Williams tied her wrists and told her she needed to learn obedience. She had reported him in Birmingham, but no conviction resulted. The defense objected, arguing that prior allegations were prejudicial. The judge ruled that the testimony was admissible because it provided context for pattern and intent relevant to the sexual assaults preceding the murders. The second former partner told her story in a flat, neutral voice. She spoke about threats, She spoke about Williams arriving without warning. She spoke about the feeling of being watched. Her testimony was not about crime scenes or physical evidence. It was about identifying the behavioral spine that ran through this case: control, possession, sexual dominance, and retaliation when control slipped away. When the jury reconvened after lunch, the prosecution called a senior officer who oversaw the Birmingham investigations. He confirmed that Williams had been linked to multiple sexual violence allegations that never reached court due to lack of corroborating evidence. The officer did not editorialize. He did not speculate about legal failures. He simply presented the administrative truth. The pattern was visible in police files long before 3 bodies lay in a house in Manchester. The third phase of the trial shifted to the defendant's account. Williams agreed to testify. He denied killing Beverley, Kesha, or Fred. He told the court he had cared for Beverley, that they had a complicated relationship, that he had been at the house days before the murders, but not during the murders. He said someone else must have entered. He said the DNA was residual contact. But the prosecution confronted him with a sequence of forensic cornerstones: DNA from fresh sexual assault kits, not old bedding or toothbrushes. Fingerprints on a cocoa butter container moved during the night of the murders. Footwear impressions matched trainers seized on arrest. Blood spatter on clothing found in his accommodation. Williams attempted explanations: borrowing clothes, secondary transfer, accidental contact, but they fell apart under the specificity of the data. Then came a question the prosecutor delivered without raising his voice. Why did you not call emergency services after discovering their bodies, if your claim is that an intruder had killed them? Williams paused. He said he panicked. He said he did not think clearly. The prosecution allowed silence to fill the courtroom before moving on. After Williams stepped down, the jury heard final testimony from Beverley's colleagues at Manchester Royal Infirmary. They described her as reliable, punctual, devoted to her children. They confirmed she was alive and well on the eve of the murders, and that she had expressed fear about Williams' behaviour in the weeks prior. When the evidence portion concluded, the judge instructed the jury on the law: intent, sexual assault, unlawful killing, reasonable doubt, and the permissible use of prior allegations to understand behavioural patterns. The barristers delivered closing speeches. The prosecution framed the case as a chain linked by science, behaviour, and opportunity. The defence urged the jury to consider the absence of eyewitnesses, to consider the possibility of unknown intruders, and to consider the consequences of convicting a man based on allegations rather than convictions. The jury retired to deliberate. They did not rush. They requested transcripts of forensic evidence. They asked for clarification on DNA interpretation. They examined the timeline carefully. It took them 3 days to reach a verdict. They filed into the courtroom slowly, eyes fixed ahead. The clerk asked for silence. The foreman rose. The verdicts, on all counts, would land like a weight across the room. On the afternoon of the 3rd day of deliberation, the jury returned to courtroom 1. The public gallery filled quickly, press in the front row, family members behind them, court officials standing along the back wall because the seats had already gone. The buzz of quiet whispering died as the clerk called the courtroom to order. Williams stood in the dock with his hands clasped in front of him. He looked at the jury with the same blank expression he had held through most of the trial. No nod, no acknowledgement, just stillness. The clerk asked the foreman the first question of law. The response came in a single word: guilty. There was no tremor in the voice, no hesitation, no confusion. The foreman repeated the same word 2 more times for the remaining murder counts, and again for the 2 counts of rape. Gasps broke through the gallery, not sensational, not theatrical, but the involuntary exhale of people who had waited nearly 8 months for an answer. Beverley's sister cried silently. One of Kesha's former teachers pressed a hand over her mouth. Fred's classmates, now adolescents carrying grief heavier than their age, sat frozen. Williams did not react. He stared forward, jaw set, as if waiting for someone to correct the record. His barrister leaned in and whispered something, but Williams did not move in response. The judge postponed sentencing to allow for victim impact statements and legal submissions. Court resumed later that week under the same heavy air. Before the sentence, the Crown read statements prepared by relatives. These were not dramatic or vengeful. They were matter-of-fact descriptions of the crater left behind. A colleague at Manchester Royal Infirmary wrote about Beverley's care for end-of-life patients and how some families still sent cards months after she died. A family friend described Kesha's plan to study law and her obsession with revising at the dining table, late into the night. Fred's football coach wrote that the club retired his shirt number for the rest of the season because no one wanted to wear it. None of these statements were designed to sway the court. They were records for history, written for a file that would outlive everyone in the room. When it came time for the judge to speak, the courtroom stayed absolutely still. Judges in England do not shout, they do not gesture, they do not perform, but the authority of their words is unmistakable. He described the murders as brutal, sustained, and motivated by domination. He said the evidence showed that Beverley and Kesha were sexually assaulted in acts that combined violence and humiliation, and that Fred was killed because he was present. He spoke about the lies Williams told in the witness box, the attempt to blame unknown intruders, and the complete absence of remorse. Under English law, life imprisonment is mandatory for murder. The judge then set the minimum term, 38 years before Williams could apply for parole. He would be 82 before eligibility, and even then, release was not guaranteed. Williams did not speak. He had the right to address the court, but he declined. There was no apology and no statement of innocence. He simply stared forward as if the sentencing applied to someone else. As he was taken down to the cells, one of the officers escorting him later remarked that Williams walked like a man who thought he'd been inconvenienced rather than convicted. It was not anger, it was entitlement. Outside the courthouse, reporters delivered live broadcasts to a public that already knew the headlines but wanted the details. They spoke about the minimum term, the sexual assaults, the timeline of the trial, and the earlier allegations from Birmingham that never reached conviction. They interviewed neighbours from Thelwall Avenue who described the sudden silence of the house, the forensic tents, and the weeks of police presence that turned the street into a controlled zone. Manchester's media coverage focused on the domestic context, a man with a history of violence allowed to orbit a family until the worst possible outcome. National coverage shifted toward the criminal justice aspect, how prior victims could make reports that sit dormant until they become foreshadowing. One article in a Birmingham newspaper asked bluntly whether the system had failed to protect women long before the murders. It included anonymised accounts from women who had reported Williams years earlier, describing the same pattern of strangulation, coercion, threats, and sexual force. The public did not hear these details during the trial because they were outside the admissible period. Journalists obtained them through background interviews and police confirmations after the verdict. In the days that followed, Manchester Royal Infirmary held a small internal memorial for Beverley. No cameras, no speeches for the press, just colleagues from wards and units who wanted to mark the life of someone who spent years caring for strangers. The hospital kept her locker empty for 6 months before reallocating it. Nurses placed a small plaque inside the locker before closing it for the last time. At Kesha's school, teachers created a scholarship fund in her name for students applying to study law. The fund lasted several years, supported by a mix of parents, teachers, and outside donors who remembered Kesha from her television appearance as much as from her academic potential. For Fred, the local football club held a charity match. Kids from his team played against older teenagers, switching positions at halftime so no one took it too seriously. Parents brought folding chairs and coolers. No one talked about the trial. The point was to remember a kid who wanted to score goals, not become a headline. Within policing circles, the case triggered a quiet audit of historic sexual violence allegations in Birmingham. Officers re-examined open files involving patterns of coercion and control, looking for names that had slipped out of jurisdiction or crossed county lines. It did not lead to a formal inquiry, but it did change the way repeat allegations were assessed in the West Midlands for several years afterward. Within Manchester's legal circles, the case was discussed for a different reason: the use of behavioural context in establishing sexual violence alongside homicide. Prosecutors pointed to the combination of physical evidence, digital timelines, and past behavioural testimony as a model for how to approach cases where motive appears rooted in power rather than impulsive rage. For members of the public who passed Thelwall Avenue, the house eventually returned to silence. Property crimes are cleaned, street murders are cordoned and then cleared. Domestic murders linger in memory because the house remains, the curtains remain, the driveway remains. And for years afterward, people still lower their voices when they walk past. By the end of 2008, the murders of Beverley Samuels and her children were no longer front-page stories. They became part of Manchester's catalogue of tragedies, filed between gang executions and domestic homicides, always revisited when conversations about sexual violence resurfaced. But the story did not end with sentencing. There was still the question of what Williams represented, a violent offender whose trajectory began long before Manchester, shaped by earlier victims, earlier reports, and earlier failures. That part of the story unfolded in prisons, in academic papers, in police training seminars, and in the private reflections of the people who survived him. Williams entered the prison system with the same blank composure he showed in court. New inmates with high-profile convictions are assessed first, not for rehabilitation, but for risk. Murderers who kill partners or children are marked for potential violence from other prisoners. So his first months passed inside a segregation unit built not for punishment but containment. Staff noted his behaviour as controlled, silent, compliant. He exercised daily, read newspapers whenever they circulated, and answered questions only when required. He did not talk about the murders. Prison psychologists attempted a standard psychiatric assessment. They found no psychosis, no neurological impairment, no diagnosable delusion. Instead, they found entitlement, sexual dominance as a behavioural trait, and a refusal to engage with responsibility. In clinical language, it pointed toward a personality structure organised around control rather than empathy. Over time, the system shifted him into mainstream population. He joined the gym rota and kept a rigid training schedule, weights, calisthenics, and long sessions of pacing the yard. He avoided chapel services, group therapy, and education programs. He did not join inmate hierarchies. He functioned like a man preserving his own bubble. From the outside, the world moved on. Manchester's homicide rate ebbed and flowed in the years after the murders, driven at times by organised crime and at others by domestic violence. The deaths of Beverley, Kesha, and Fred were folded into crime statistics, but within policing circles, the case became a quiet reference point in training materials that dealt with coercive control. One of the largest institutional shifts arrived not from Manchester but from Birmingham. In the early 2010s, when reformers pushed for stronger responses to non-fatal strangulation and sexual coercion, case studies surfaced of victims who had reported abuse years before later homicides. Several of those case studies came from the West Midlands. Williams appeared as a footnote in internal documents, not for the murders, but for the earlier allegations that never reached court. By 2017, England and Wales introduced legislation recognising coercive and controlling behaviour as a criminal offence. The move allowed prosecutors to pursue cases that previously fell into gaps between sexual assault, harassment, and domestic violence. Police trainers referenced historic examples when teaching young detectives why patterns matter even without physical injuries. Williams' pattern was not unique, but it was instructive. Academics studying sexual homicide cited the case in papers about mixed-motive offenders, men whose killings are not solely sexual, not solely domestic, but driven by overlapping impulses that include domination, humiliation, and revenge. The papers argued that these men do not emerge suddenly. They develop along trajectories that leave debris in the form of smaller violence. Former partners, ER reports, anonymous police statements, fragments that rarely assemble until after someone dies. Meanwhile, the families of the victims built their own forms of aftermath. Beverley's relatives kept her memory inside practical routines, holidays, graduations, the slow march of normal life. They did not engage with campaigns or media projects. They guarded privacy. For them, survival meant not being defined solely by the murders. Kesha's classmates grew into adulthood. Every few years, someone would post an old clip from Stars in Their Eyes Kids to social media. Kesha, performing, smiling, holding the microphone with a confidence that suggested a life of law school, university halls, and maybe more music. Strangers watching the clip had no idea what happened later. Sometimes those who did know would comment, gently filling in the missing piece for those who asked. Fred's name resurfaced most often in youth football circles, older teenagers who remembered him as a quick runner with a competitive streak. His coach once said that the hardest part was not what happened, but how little space exists in public discourse for murdered boys. He argued that girls receive tributes as potential lawyers, dancers, musicians, while boys receive headlines as victims. Fred never grew old enough to show potential. Grief lived in that unfinished space. The house on Thelwall Avenue changed hands eventually. Crime scene remediation removed all trace of the murders, and new occupants built a life there. Curtains in the windows, cars in the drive, bins put out on Wednesdays. Only neighbours remembered what happened. Some avoided looking at the house directly. Some looked too long. As for Williams, prison records indicate he lodged complaints over gym access, meal times, and perceived disrespect from staff. He did not express remorse, did not engage with restorative programs, and did not respond to invitations from psychologists trying to map violent sexual offenders for research. He maintained innocence even as the forensic evidence against him sat uncontested. Time does different things to an offender than to a community. For Williams, time is measured in sentence progression, behaviour reports, parole, eligibility, years. For Manchester, time is measured in anniversaries, in shifting criminal landscapes, in cycles of violence and reform. Nearly 2 decades after the murders, conversations about domestic homicide changed. Police forces began using predictive analysis for high-risk domestic abuse cases. Emergency departments flagged patients presenting with strangulation injuries because data showed a strong link between non-fatal strangulation and later homicide. Charities pushed for better tracking of serial perpetrators, men who move between partners, between cities, leaving victims behind without anyone linking the pattern. Inside that reform space, scholars would sometimes mention a case from 2007 in Manchester involving a nurse, her teenage daughter, and her teenage son, killed by a former partner with a history of sexual dominance. They mentioned it not for the media headlines, but for the pattern visible in the years before the murders. That became the cultural memory, not the sensational brutality of the crime, but the system gaps that preceded it. When journalists revisit the case today, they don't ask whether Williams will walk free. His minimum term makes that question theoretical for decades. They ask how many earlier cases mirror the same structure: coercion, rejection, escalation, homicide. Criminologists answer that these cases are not random explosions. They are trajectories. the violence grows in size, not in type. That is the part of the story that lands hardest for those who study it. Because the murders of Beverley, Kesha, and Fred were not the beginning, they were the point at which all the warning signs converged. In the end, the legacy of the case is split in two: a family erased inside a Manchester home and a set of systemic lessons that arrived too late for them. That is how the story sits now, quiet, heavy, and unfinished in the only way such stories can be.